Welcome the chosen ones. Some individuals want to avoid controversy and karma, but you selected one. You just matrixed your way through a full-fledged spiritual assassination attempt without even flinching. Let it sink in, because the fact is that you weren't just fortunate. You were tagged, monitored, and targeted. Something or someone was relying on your demise. And to be quite honest, it wasn't simply a horrible phase or a hard patch. You were the target of a cosmic takedown. You slid through it like mist, between fingers, without breaking, pleading, or even recognizing it. Fact: over % of persons who undergo psychological warfare as a result of betrayal, familial tragedy, narcissistic abuse, or severe spiritual disillusionment never completely recover. But here you are, still standing, brilliant, and impenetrable. That isn't chance. That is not a good mood. That is divine preservation. And, more significantly, that demonstrates who you really are. You know, when average people are struck, they need team rehabilitation. 2 years off the grid, including a spiritual retreat in the Himalayas. You stroll through hell with your edges still in place and your sense of humor intact. And while they were busy targeting their shots, they overlooked one little fact. You don't just survive. You reroute energy like a restless spiritual wanderer. So saddle up, because in this video, we'll go over precisely what you avoided, how you did it, and why your survival revealed everything they attempted to hide. By the conclusion of this, you will not just feel like a walking miracle. You'll understand why the adversary had a breakdown when you were alive. First and foremost, you did not escape unharmed. You served as a decoy in a conflict that was not yours. What almost killed you was never intended for you. That's the unpleasant truth. Most people around you have no idea you're merely standing in a place created by someone else in the midst of a storm. Someone else summoned. The turmoil that engulfed your life was unrelated to your actions, personality, or decisions. You were the decoy. You were the one. The spiritual realm was exploited to reveal a system, lineage, or evil accord that had been hidden in plain sight. And it had to be you, because if it had been someone else, they would have collapsed. You just dodged a bullet. It was not arbitrary. It wasn't an accident. It was orchestrated. But here's what adds depth. The true goal was the system behind you. The disease you were born with. The secret pact struck by someone else long before you arrived. That gunshot delivered a reality too hard for most people to handle. It was meant to break everyone who came in its way, and the person who was initially intended to capture it. They were unable to manage it. So life diverted it to you. Not to harm you, but to expose everything and everyone hiding behind you. That's why the assaults were so personal. That is why the betrayal struck so profoundly. That's why you experienced sorrow in waves. You didn't believe you could endure since you weren't just dealing with today's turmoil. You carried the weight of centuries' worth of life. You were given a mess that was not yours in order to bring the truth to light. They needed someone spiritually strong enough to withstand the blow and live. That person was you. You didn't merely avoid a gunshot. You absorbed its full force and transformed it into revelation. The opponent did not expect you to go away unscathed. They didn't expect you to still be capable of loving, trusting, and loving. And they certainly did not expect you to find out what had occurred. But you did. And suddenly everything is revealed. The masks are off. The enchantment has broken. And you are not merely a survivor. You are evidence that spiritual weapons are ineffective against heavenly objectives. Not if the aim becomes the truth. Number 2. You were set to self-destruct, but God rewired the bomb. You were programmed to self-destruct. This was not by chance. Not at random. There was a whole system, visible and hidden, relying on your demise. People in your life may have smiled in your face, but they were secretly waiting for you to shatter. They lied to you, toyed with your emotions, isolated you, stimulated your grief, and hoped you would eventually crack. Spiritually, it went far deeper. Dark forces watched your every move, identifying your weak points, analyzing your stillness, fragility, and exhaustion. They were aware that you were approaching a breaking point, and they believed they had ideal timing. You were on the verge of a full mental, emotional, and physical breakdown. That's the closest it got. But something occurred that no one anticipated, not even you. Just when it appeared like you'd finally crashed something in, you reversed the wiring in your soul, which was hard-coded by divine design, shifting the trigger they put to kill you. It was hijacked. Instead of breaking, you restarted. Instead of giving up, you dug deeper. Your breakdown became a reset, and what was meant to be finished, you ended up reactivating a portion of yourself. They assumed it was long gone. That's the miracle they can't figure out. Everything remained the same from the outside. But inwardly, it was as if God had rewired the whole control system as everyone watched the breakdown. You did more than simply survive. You improved. You returned with better eyesight, more knowledge, more strength, and a new degree of clarity that revealed every falsehood and setup. And now the individuals and spirits who planned your demise are perplexed. They were certain you were done. They were preparing your eulogy while God was revising your instructions. You weren't spared at the last second merely to rest peacefully. You were saved because your existence is essential to something far larger. That near call was not only about you. It was all about time, legacy, and divine retribution. Each time you laugh, you recover and achieve. Now you're showing that devastation was never your destiny. You were designed to weather storms that most people would crumble beneath, and they'll never comprehend how the system they created to break you became the reason you soared. Number 3, what you evaded was not a bullet. It was a soul trap meant to suppress your purpose indefinitely. What you fled wasn't just a horrible scenario. It was a spiritual trap meant to entrap your soul and destroy your mission. The bullet they fired was not intended to kill you. It was intended to steal your identity. It was intended to make you wonder who you are, doubt your voice, and abandon your calling. It wasn't just about agony. It was about programming. They intended to entirely alter your perception of yourself, so that even if you physically experienced it, the true you would not emerge. They were not aiming at your body. They were seeking your thoughts. They were seeking your will. They were seeking your heavenly remembrance. The part of you that understands who you are and why you are here. They nearly got it. That's why it seems so perplexing. That's why you couldn't think clearly. That is why everything around you began to seem artificial or twisted. It was more than simply emotional. It was spiritual interference. They hoped you'd lose your hold on reality long enough to be replaced by another version of yourself. They had the ability to influence, control, or silence others indefinitely. But it did not work. Even when you didn't comprehend what was going on, or when you felt absolutely exhausted, your spirit refused to give up. Something deep within, you remembered your homework. Something in you said no without using words. That internal rejection rescued you. What happened next was much more powerful. When the trap failed, they weren't sure what to do with you. Because you are now conscious. Now you know how subtle the assault was. You saw how individuals were being exploited without even realizing it. You could feel your vitality draining, your soul becoming confined, and your name losing its significance. You've come out of it with clarity. They are unable to make or generate electricity. They cannot cancel. That trap was made to be escaped. You felt lost and unconnected for years. It was intended to force you to accept a version of yourself that was much inferior to your true potential. But you broke out. You not only survived, but also exposed it. That is why you are walking differently today. That is why your presence makes others uneasy. You're no longer puzzled. You've recovered. You are real. And you are not going back. Number 4, you are more than simply a miracle. You are live evidence that hell has loopholes. You were not intended to make it. Not based on the cycles you were born into. Not according to the trauma that attempted to change your future. Not based on the generational curses that had never been broken before you. Everything said no. The odds, the surroundings, familial problems, mental conflicts, and betrayals. They all pointed to one outcome: collapse. However, you discovered a solution that neither logic nor faith can explain. You slipped through a spiritual gap that only those with heavenly power could detect. That is why the majority of people do not understand your narrative. People around you have seen you go through things that should have crushed you, and now they don't know how to handle the reality that you're still here, clear-headed, grounded, and more strong than before. It confuses them since they've seen others suffer through less and never recover. But you walked through flames and somehow didn't smell like smoke. Not because you had greater resources or because you had assistance, but because something beyond human comprehension intervened and created a path where there was none. You were not only rescued, you were pulled out like a malfunction in the infernal system. You weren't intended to be the one who got out of that poisonous environment, abusive relationship, mental breakdown, betrayal, and spiritual tiredness. The opponent expected the process to repeat with you, but you shattered it. You fled a destiny that has consumed humanity for millennia. The most astonishing element was that you had no idea how you accomplished it since you weren't the one performing the escape. It was something holy that pulled you through. You're now going around with proof that spiritual warfare can be reversed, contracts established in darkness can be terminated, curses can be rewritten, and destiny can overrule harm. You're the living loophole. Hell never intended for this. You are the unexpected paradox that the opponent never saw coming. And that's precisely why they can't figure you out. You are not merely a miracle. You are a system breach. When divine intervention selects you, you are evidence that it exists and is unstoppable. Number 5, your survival shamed whole lineages that had gambled against you. They didn't just want you to fail. They needed you because your fall was part of a long-term deal. A generational pattern that kept your lineage tied and shattered. You weren't just the next in line to suffer. You were meant to be evidence that no one escapes, and that no one in your family succeeds. That nobody challenges the stillness. You were picked not just to bear the weight, but also to collapse beneath it, just like others who came before you. Instead of breaking, you revealed the whole system. What you endured did not just release you. It sent shockwaves across both the spiritual and natural lineages. You humiliated the devils that were assigned to you before you were born. You embarrassed the history of dysfunction that wore your family name like a badge because you were never supposed to challenge it. You were not intended to see it, but you saw everything, and you talked about it. You called it out. Stop pretending. In doing so, you accomplished something no one else had: the determination, lucidity, or bravery to act. Your survival was not just personal, it was prophetic. The folks who gambled on your collapse are now forced to sit in the uncomfortable of your light. You didn't just get through. You became a light so brilliant that it exposed every hidden serpent, secret curse, and quiet treachery that had been weaved into your childhood. They used to laugh at your suffering, gossip about your breakdowns, and dismiss you as too delicate to live. But now you're living evidence that sensitivity is powerful when combined with purpose. And your very existence is making others uncomfortable, not because you've changed, but because you notice them now. They labeled it weakness, but it was truly your awakening. What they sought to bury was your root system, as well as the altar on which they attempted to sacrifice you. That became the setting for your call. They wanted you to die with the truth hidden inside of you. But you lived and talked, and suddenly the whole foundation is crumbling. Because one thing no bloodline expects is the one who breaks the curse. Walking back into the room, very aware of who they are. Number 6, you're not difficult to kill. You are difficult to replace. They keep coming for you, not because you are weak, but because you are too vital to be overlooked. You've undoubtedly wondered, why do I feel like I'm constantly under attack? And here's the fact that most people refuse to acknowledge. It is because they cannot replicate you. They have tried spiritually, emotionally, and energetically. But the frequency you carry, the mission engraved in your being, it cannot be imitated, fabricated, or handed on to a replacement. You're not difficult to kill, you're impossible to replace. And it is the true menace. You were not assaulted only to be silenced. You were assaulted in order to destroy what you were about to give: your talent, vision, voice, and spiritual DNA. It affects something much beyond their control. You're still here because the assaults were strong. Your aim is fireproof. It's built into the design of something so much larger that even hell needs to step aside when it fails. Every time they believed they had finally eliminated you, they were really reinforcing your position. Every unsuccessful effort was not just an accident. It was a heavenly confirmation that you are needed. That is why they want to exhaust you rather than kill you. It has never been about a swift kill. It's been about draining your energy until you quit turning up, which makes you question your value, until you quiet yourself. Even when you were fatigued, misunderstood, alone, and running on fumes, you refused to give up. And it scared them since you weren't supposed to be able to see properly after going through all of that. You don't just survive. You are disruptive. You stroll inside rooms and change the ambience. You talk. Things that were previously concealed begin to emerge. When you remain motionless, individuals begin to unveil who they really are. That cannot be replaced. That cannot be duplicated. And that is why the resistance never stops. Because when someone like you totally commits to your task, systems fail. You don't simply travel light. You carry structure. And without you, something important fails. That is why the darkness keeps coming. Not because you are frail, but because your sheer presence renders the whole scheme unstable. Number 7. You are not safeguarded only for yourself. Your success triggered a chain reaction. You thought your breakthrough was only about regaining your peace, your mind, and your life back. But it was far more than that when you emerged from what was attempting to destroy you. It didn't just liberate you. It caused a discharge across spiritual networks you weren't aware existed. Your emancipation was a supernatural domino effect. Something old and bound up in the soul burst free the minute you spoke. I'm done suffering in quiet. The moment you preferred healing, accountability, truth, and clarity above chaos and uncertainty. You shattered the codes that had kept others in place for years. You don't know it, but someone else's chain broke when you woke up that morning and refused to give up. Someone's voice returned the minute you began speaking openly about what had occurred to you. Someone mustered the fortitude to leave, confront, and heal. Because they saw your survival. What they were told would kill them. Here's where things get crazy. You may never meet such individuals. You may never know their names. But their liberation is dependent on your obedience, not your perfection. That's why the enemies attacked you so aggressively. It was not merely to halt you. It was to avoid the upheaval that your liberation would generate. Individuals cannot intimidate darkness. It is frightened of chain reactions since one selected individual opting to break a curse is risky. But one selected individual inspires 10 others to do the same. That is unstoppable. That is revival. That is why you cannot be left alone. That is why the assaults were strategic. Because each time you recover, someone else experiences a rush of bravery. Every time you relate your experience, someone else starts to doubt their own. Your perseverance had nothing to do with pride. It was protection with a purpose. God did not rescue you alone to keep you secure. God rescued you so that you may motivate others. So, no, your survival was not about ego or proving someone incorrect. It was about divine timing. You provided the blueprint for someone else's breakthrough. And now that you've made it out, the ripple effect has already begun. The system attempted to keep you silent, but your independence transformed you into a frequency. And now they can't shut you down because you have multiplied. Number 8. They attempted to gaslight you into not noticing the gun. You're now teaching people how to locate the weapon. They didn't just wish to harm you. They wanted you to assume that there was no weapon at all. The pain was in your brain, your instincts were incorrect, and your emotions were excessive. They pointed the pistol at you, then challenged you to name it what it was. When you flinched, they grinned. When you spoke out, they twisted things. When you eventually began pulling away, they identified you as the issue. That was not only emotional abuse. That was spiritual battle, dressed in charm, guilt traps, and false concern. And it was calculated. You were not overreacting. You were under siege. The objective was straightforward. Disarm your discernment. If they could make you doubt what you saw and felt, they could continue to operate in the shadows without being challenged. They wanted you to question your own clarity so much that you would finally give them your voice to maintain the peace. But they didn't plan for your awakening, that moment when everything came into clarity, not via drama or vengeance, but through a peaceful realization that the falsehoods had ceased working. When you no longer found the patterns perplexing, when the bogus apologies ceased calming you down, you became deadly. Because you are no longer merely avoiding red flags. You break them down. You identify tone changes, energy drains, wordplay, and strategic elements. You maintain silent. A narcissist may be identified even when dressed in spiritual garb. You can tell the difference between actual help and surveillance. And you're no longer embarrassed by how strongly you feel or how profoundly you perceive what they criticized as oversensitivity turned out to be sophisticated intuition. What they termed crazy was prophetic clarity. What they called paranoia was spiritual X-ray vision. You don't merely endure manipulation anymore. You deconstruct it. Even better, you educate others how to help you recover. Became a curriculum. Your trauma became both a tool set and a tale. It's no longer a question of survival. It is a warning shot. You're no longer fleeing from the weapon. You are one who seeks to expose, disrupt patterns, and stop quiet rather than to damage. You are the result. Nobody expected this, and the game has ended. Because now you can see everything. Number 9. Your quiet was not strength, it was monitoring. They assumed your quiet indicated that you were weak, afraid, or dumb. However, you were not sitting quietly in defeat. You were seeing everything and listening with your soul wide open. You saw the tone changes, the forced grins, and the faux worry disguised as friendliness as they performed. You recorded their conversation. You kept mental notes. Every manipulation, backhanded praise, half-truth, every power play. You did not miss it. You were not passive. You were in deep observation mode. You chose not to speak because you understood the game was greater than what was being spoken. You could sense the spiritual weight of people's statements. You could tell when someone's enthusiasm did not match their appearance. You didn't want to argue with liars. You wanted to know how the deceit worked. And so you let them speak. You allowed them to dig their own holes. You made them feel comfortable exposing who they were. Because when you're selected, quiet does not imply submission. It's a strategy. What they thought was apathy turned out to be insight. You were not rising above the drama. You were accumulating patterns. When the room changed, you watched to see who swapped sides. You were watching who gave you a tight-jawed clap after you won. You were watching who has apologized only when exposure was imminent. You were not frozen. You were decoding. You saved that knowledge not for vengeance, but for revelation. Because you don't just know what occurred. Do you understand why that quiet trained you? It improved your judgment. It reprogrammed your instincts. It helped you achieve a degree of spiritual understanding that cannot be taught in books or churches. You can go into a room and read the vibe without anybody speaking. Truth may be heard in someone's voice or in its absence. You can detect manipulation before it occurs because you listened when it was unsafe to talk. Your quiet was not cowardice. It was a surveillance operation. And now that you've gotten everything you needed, you're not as silent. You are calibrated. You are clear. And you're pointing up details that they can't refute. They were unprepared for the version of you that listened first and talked second. But now that version is walking with purpose. Every liar in the room feels exposed without you saying anything. Number 10. Your foe's confidence was their undoing. They did not simply miss. They exposed themselves. They came for you, brave and reckless. Assuming you were still blind, naive, and too emotionally tangled up to see clearly. What they didn't comprehend was that by assaulting you so boldly, they had given you the blueprint. Their pride did not only cause them to underestimate you, it forced them to unveil themselves. Every motion they made, every phony grin, every backhanded remark, wasn't simply an act of violence. This was a confession. Because spiritual perception does not need a smoking gun. It merely requires proximity and patterns. They gave you both. The adversary never expected you'd have the clarity to not only survive, but also to analyze, trace connections, hear what wasn't uttered, and note who fell mute when things became dark for you to observe, who cheered when you tripped. What they believed was a clean takedown evolved into a complete exposure. And while they thought you were withdrawing, you were really recording mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. When they noticed you were still standing, it was too late. You already have your receipts. Not for vengeance, but for liberation. You saw who they really were. And now you know what you should never let go of again. When they shot at you, they did more than simply miss. Their weapon malfunctioned, and their slander fell flat. Their union disintegrated. Their manipulation methods, which had previously worked on everyone else, failed terribly on you because you were not emotionally invested. You were functioning at an elevation. And when you witness the storm from a higher elevation, you are not drawn into the pandemonium. You plan it out. You now move with intelligence. They never intended to offer you the fire behind the words. You're aware of the terror beneath the mask. You understand who was sent and who was self-serving. The onslaught gave you X-ray vision and the courage they used to pursue you. It is now the mirror, reflecting everything they attempted to conceal. You didn't just avoid the bullet. You watched it in slow motion. I studied the gunman, tracked his fingerprints, and left the scene with clarity. They are unable to recover from. And now that you can see them clearly, the game is done. Not because you triumphed, but because they finally revealed who they had always been. A number. They utilized every weapon. But there is one thing they cannot manufacture: favor. They tried everything. Covert techniques, public smear campaigns, covert sabotage, charm with one hand and a dagger with the other. They used spells, curses, rumor, shadow, and psychic traps. However, they lacked one thing. And no matter how many dark tools they used, they couldn't fake it indefinitely. That was the one thing that caused every single assault to fail under its own weight. Favors are not earned in the same way that paychecks are. It's not about being good enough, clever enough, or physically powerful enough. It's something wonderful that has always been a part of you, inscribed into your essence before you ever breathed. Favor is not about being superior than others. It's about being allocated. And no matter what they tried, they could never create your task. They couldn't take your oil since it wasn't stored in a container. It was part of your design. They assumed that if they dumped enough dirt, your name would not rise. If they changed the story, you would lose credibility. If they isolate you, you will lose momentum. If they obstructed you, God would cease moving. But Favre does not follow man's rules. It does not take polls. It does not check popularity. It does not need authorization. Favre disrupts protocols and overrides configurations. Every time they created a weapon, Favre changed the result. This is why the pistol jammed every time. It was not a glitch. It was divine intervention. Favre makes you seem untouchable. People, however, do not perceive the battle that has led to your survival. They do not know how many nights you sobbed. How many times did you question how close you were to quitting up? They only see the recovery, the light, and the breezes that shouldn't have been possible given everything you've gone through. And it is what troubles them the most. Because, despite all they did, Favre still exists, and they cannot decipher, dilute, or erase it. You weren't retained because you were flawless. You were kept because you were summoned. And the throne they attempted to protect you from, it's already etched with your name. That explains why none of it worked. Not the spells, defamation, or traps. Because the one thing they couldn't touch was the thing that had been carrying you all along, Favre. And it does not bend. It covers a number. You didn't just survive death. You altered the definition. You did not just brush up against death. You've been through versions of it that don't have tombstones but still leave scars, the type of deaths that don't make headlines. But they kill people every day. Death of the ego. When you discover that the version of yourself you created to survive is strangling the authentic you. Death of connections you promised would endure forever but had to let go in order to preserve your soul. The death of trust. When you recognize that not everyone who grins is secure. The death of belief. When you quit attempting to win love and chose to inhabit it instead. And you didn't simply keep breathing. You changed. You shed skin so thick that it seemed like a whole life. You outgrew rooms while others were still attempting to bind you to your past. You let pieces of yourself to die because they no longer matched your frequency. And in the process, you found a new type of existence. When they do not educate you about a spiritually based existence rather than a survivalist one. A life marked by knowledge rather than scars. See, true chosen ones no longer fear death because we have already buried versions of ourselves that were more deadly to us than our foes were. What worries the world about you right now is not your survival. It's that you come back stronger, sharper, gentler in soul, but more difficult to fool. They attempted to bury you without understanding you weren't in a casket. You were in a cocoon. People who sought to lament your failure are now seeing your resurrection in real time. The people who toss dirt are stuck watching flowers develop from where they believe they stopped. They don't comprehend how you're still alive, thriving, radiant, and rising. That is because you have progressed beyond their concept of life and death. To them, Death represents the end. To you, death is simply statistics. A chapter is a clearing. You didn't just survive death. You transformed it. You demonstrated that being broken is not the end of the narrative. It marks the beginning of genuine power. And you are no longer plagued by the events that almost killed you. It powers you. A number. They believed destroying your confidence would suffice. They didn't see the resurrection coming. They never had to physically touch you. Their preferred weapon was psychological, which included subtle jabs, cold shoulders, whispered doubts, and planned rejections. They did not want to completely wreck your life. It was to undermine your self-esteem from the inside out. Because if they could destroy your confidence, they wouldn't have to halt your mission. You would stop yourself. For a time, it worked. You second-guessed your presence. You shrunk yourself to make others comfortable. You remained silent while your soul was screaming. You glanced in the mirror and didn't recognize the person gazing back. That was the actual combat. Not survival, but identification. And as they celebrated your supposed demise, you remained in the shadows, shattering the illusion. You were facing every falsehood you'd acquired, every label they put on you, every germ of doubt placed throughout your upbringing. The resurrection did not occur in the spotlight. It occurred in quiet and loneliness, in the evenings when you had nothing more to prove, and all is left to recover. You encountered your raw self, the version they attempted to persuade you did not exist, and you selected them. That was when the true danger started. Because when a selected person recalls who they are, the environment changes. You didn't merely heal, you sparked. Your presence began revealing agendas. Your confidence began to cause anxieties you had no idea they had. You strolled into places where you used to shrink, and people had no idea where to look. That's because they were never afraid of your mouth. They were afraid of your lucidity. And now you can see straight through them. You did not gotten haughty. You became aligned. And the light of that alignment blinds those who were previously comfortable manipulating you in your uncertainty. You aren't simply shining. You are radioactive because your confidence is no longer based on compliments. It's based on evidence. Proof that you survived. Proof that you've been called. Proof that the denial was a redirection. Now they can't touch you. Not because you are untouchable, but because you are unmistakable. They attempted to destroy your confidence, believing that would be the end. They didn't comprehend that faith in a chosen one never expires. It emerges stronger, louder, and this time untamed. A number. You are not a survivor. You are a spiritual system upgrade. You are more than simply someone who got out. That terminology hardly scratches the surface of what transpired. Survivors flee. You completely altered the battlefield. You didn't just navigate a storm. You affected the environment, causing future storms to impact everyone after you differently. You elevated the whole spiritual landscape by traversing through hell without adopting its language, terror, or rationale. That is not survival. That is a complete system override. The strikes did not start missing because the opponent gave up. They missed because you're no longer using the same spiritual operating system. You are no longer guided by trauma-based responses. You aren't provoked the same way. You are not as easily distracted or confused as you formerly were. They're still using the same techniques. Lies, solitude, and emotional sabotage. However, it seems that they are now speaking in an antiquated dialect. They're putting in garbled code, attempting to hack something that's no longer linked to the grid. You've gone offline from their grasp and back online via heavenly protocol. Your promotion did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived silently in the dark evenings after you chose alignment over approbation. When you opted to heal rather than pretend. When you stopped merely surviving and began upgrading. You didn't just recover. You renovated your spiritual infrastructure. You recoded your self-worth. You have updated your summit software. Your heart has new defenses. Your mind has a new encryption. You no longer rely on fear updates or people-pleasing plugins. You are running divine, unkillable, a system that hell literally cannot handle. That's why they're perplexed, and their access seems clogged. Why do their words bounce off? Why their setups fail? You're not fortunate. It's that you're no longer compatible with the strategies that used to drive you apart. You've progressed beyond their capabilities. You are not a glitch in the system. You are the new system. The live walking patch that shattered every generational curse they assumed would last forever. You're the spiritual upgrade no one expected, yet everyone's suddenly compelled to accept that hell is outmoded. You are not. And it is the most hazardous thing. You are not merely cured. You've been upgraded. Let us be clear. It wasn't simply survival. This represented spiritual software progress. This was a miraculous disturbance. This was a cosmic jailbreak from systems both visible and invisible, meant to mute, distract, drain, or delete you. But nothing worked. Not because the weapons did not exist, but because you ceased functioning at the frequency that made you a match for them. You stopped dealing with guilt, manipulation, and humiliation. You stopped need validation to walk in authority. You stopped making the mistake of suffering for loyalty. And that's when the traditional assaults began to fail. That's when hell's programming began glitching every time it attempted to penetrate your environment. You did not. By accident, you were picked by design. Your presence disrupts generations-old systems. You are the ghost. They could not extinguish the blaze. They couldn't hide the seed they believed they had buried, not realizing it would develop roots so deep as to displace tectonic plates. You did not just flee. You changed the laws. Engagement. You established a precedent in the spiritual sphere. You made it obvious that favor is not fragile and calling is not negotiable. Your renewed confidence was a warning shot. Your understanding evolved into a weapon they never imagined. And your silence, that was not weakness. It was a strategy. You were listening through barriers, gathering codes, and getting ready for a level where you didn't have to battle to be noticed. Your very existence would be an announcement. Now, your glow is more than just beauty, it's intelligence. Your walk has not merely been healed. It is encoded. You have a frequency that makes liars stammer, manipulators fidget, and viewers worry. Not because you want vengeance, but because you have revelation. You are evidence that favor outweighs fear, that grace outruns terror, and that spiritual power does not yell. It changes rooms. So let them chat. Let them wonder how you did it. How you are still soaring. How come nothing seems to stick? They'll never figure it out since they're attempting to decipher a system that was not designed in human language. You are not merely a survivor. You are a walking update, an unexplained issue in the enemy's coding, and the most terrible aspect for your adversaries. You are just getting started. If this message resonated with you in the same way that truth always does, do not keep it to yourself. Allow it to breathe. Click the subscribe button to ensure you never miss any downloads specialized for the chosen. Tap, as if this reminded you of how strong, unkillable, and divinely enhanced you really are. Leave a comment below. I want to hear about your fire, survival, and ascent. And if you know someone who has been waging a quiet battle and needs to be reminded that they are not alone, share this with them. This channel is more than simply content. This is a call, a safe haven for the misread. They undervalued those who constructed their spiritual foundation from beginning. So enable notification sessions since your next confirmation can be in the following upload. You aren't here by chance. You're here because the frequency was discovered. You keep connected, unshaken, and remember that you did not just survive. You are to blame for the previous system crashing. See you in the future video. Family, God bless you.